Gordon Gray is the Director of Fiscal Policy for the American Action Forum, and he joins us from Washington. Mr. Gray, welcome to Bottom Line. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Sir, I have to start by asking, when you hear the figure $16.7 trillion, what's the first thing that goes through your mind?
Bigger than 15, and bigger than this, which is coincidentally about the size of our economy. So it's bigger than the scale of the U.S. economy, which is a bad place to be.
Sir, we saw this movie, the debt ceiling movie, before in 2011. Is it safe to say that no lessons were learned from that drama?
Well, I think, I think some lessons were learned, and I have a couple observations I'd like to make.
Sure.
First is you do have to increase it. I think both sides were clearly willing to go to the line, but not step over it. And I think that's a critical understanding that everyone should take away, is that at the end of the day, it's something that has to be done. And second is it has to become law, which means it's got to pass the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the President has to sign it. And so I think that that's important when we think about, particularly now when we're many months away from this really being an immediate issue.
Right.
Because both sides are going to start posturing. We've seen it already with Secretary Liu's letter, which in fairly strong language essentially said that they're just not willing to negotiate over anything related to the debt ceiling. And I think what's clear, even for the sort of modest policy riders that went along with the February increase, is
right.
They're willing to scrap this notion of a clean debt limit increase,
okay,
because it's frankly not really been the historical experience.
Well, Mr. Gray, you just mentioned Treasury Secretary Liu's letter. He sent that to congressional leaders. He wrote, quoting here, "The creditworthiness of the United States is non-negotiable. The question of whether the country must pay obligations it has already incurred is not open to debate," end quote. But Republicans, as you know, want spending concessions before they agree to raise the debt limit again. How does this all play out then?
Well, I actually think that the last increase was instructive. What you didn't see was a line in the sand with congressional Republicans that said you have to increase spending, or reduce spending, or raise certain eligibility, sort of bright lines for congressional Democrats. Because again, like I said, you got to get it through both chambers. And so instead, you had some other policy concessions, probably that the White House wasn't crazy about. The No Budget, No Pay Act actually forced the Senate to finally get around to pass a budget, take some tough votes. So I think some lessons can be learned from that.
Mr. Gray, when Congress voted to suspend the debt limit back in January, it did so to avoid the risk of default. Lawmakers focused instead on sequestration, and we know how that turned out. But in an irony only Washington could come up with, did the sequester's spending cuts give the White House and Congress some debt ceiling breathing room?
I guess compared to what would have otherwise been the case, sure. But the United States is still on track to, according to the Treasury Borrowing Authority, they're still going to borrow over, the net marketable borrowing will be over $800 billion a year. So the United States is still going to have to stay in the red for the rest of the year and for the foreseeable future. Sorry, sir.
No, I'm sorry. Moody's is warning that unless there's a budget deal this year, the U.S. faces a credit downgrade. If the debt limit isn't raised, the government wouldn't be able to fund its operations. We've been through this before as well. But the downgrade in 2011, it didn't have the catastrophic consequences some had feared. What would be different now?
Well, I think when you start seeing a steady drumbeat rather than what I think some people wrote as an aberration to 2011 to a newly empowered House of Representatives. But if you see a consistent message sort of coming out from external forces, capital markets, saying we're not as sanguine on the U.S. debt outlook, then I think it ought to give people pause. That's why I say, again, my first point about the debt limit is you do have to raise it. You can't play you can't put at risk that full faith in credit. But that said, you still gotta. You also have to balance that with signaling to credit marketers that you're serious about making sure that you can one day make good on those obligations by not being so far into debt.
Gordon Gray, he's the Director of Fiscal Policy for the American Action Forum, joining us from Washington. Mr. Gray, thanks so much for coming on tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
When Bottom Line continues.